Welcome to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by me, Jen Trzeciak.
And me, Aideen Ruttledge.
This podcast is dedicated to exploring the world of occupational therapy, sharing the latest research and techniques and providing insights into the many ways that occupational therapy can help people of all ages live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Whether you are a practicing occupational therapist, a student of occupational therapy, or simply curious about this fascinating field, this podcast is for you. We'll be interviewing experts in the field, sharing stories from the front lines of occupational therapy practice, and providing tips and advice for anyone looking to get the most out of their therapy.
So sit back, relax, and join us on this exciting journey into the world of occupational therapy in Ireland. You're very welcome to this episode of the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast. Today we have Niall Kirrane. Niall is the chairperson of the AOTI Gender and Sexuality Advisory Group. And Niall, you co-authored the LGBT plus awareness and good practice guidelines, which I think probably every OT in Ireland should be aware of, probably are. But I saw recently you were in Japan as well, promoting your good work abroad, which is really exciting, and congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Niall's also a clinical specialist, occupational therapist in Ireland's National Gender Service, which is a really exciting and interesting role. So Niall, you're really welcome to the podcast. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So it's not many OTs that you meet who are clinical specialists in this area. Tell us a little bit about the gender service and about the OT role in the gender service.
Yeah, sure. So it's a bit of a professionally isolating area to work in, but also a very kind of rewarding one. And I hope it won't be that case for very long. I think it's going to be a real growing area for occupational therapy. In the National Gender Service here in Ireland, it's a service for adults who are seeking gender healthcare, so 18 plus years of age. It has a very multidisciplinary approach, I guess, to transgender healthcare. So our team is composed of kind of all of the health and social care professions really that there are. We have OT, psychology, speech and language therapy, social work, in addition to kind of nursing and more medical professionals. And basically we offer support for those who are looking to medically transition and access medical interventions as part of their gender transition. So the main ones being hormone therapy, which people might be familiar with. We also have pathways for surgeries, which don't happen in the country, but happen abroad and are funded by the HSE. But I think that working in the National Gender Service, where, I think there's over 1,000 people kind of actively receiving care from our service, you have the benefit of just seeing the massive diversity and experience of trans people, and really seeing that hormones and surgery, while very important medical interventions, aren't always kind of enough, or some people need additional supports, I think, in addition to those medical supports. And that's where the likes of, I guess, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, social work, psychology support all come into play as well. But yeah, OT is the most recent addition to the multidisciplinary team. I'm in position for about 3 years now, kind of slowly building up and developing what the occupational therapy service is, which is really exciting, but also challenging for sure, because even outside of Ireland, internationally, there isn't a huge amount to go on in terms of what the occupational therapy role is in transgender healthcare. So it's new and innovative and challenging and exciting, all wrapped up into one.
All at the same time.
Yeah.
Niall, how did you specialise in this area? What postgraduate training did you do? How did you arrive here?
Yeah, I guess my background as an occupational therapist has always been in mental health. I went into OT thinking very sure that I was going to work in spinal rehab, and then I had a third year mental health placement, and that changed everything for me. So the early years of my career, I guess I spent in community mental health, and then in a student disability service in a third level institution here in Dublin. And actually it was kind of a combination of factors. I think working with student population kind of brought about, I think, that diversity that you might not see in other settings, where there was a huge amount of gender diversity and different identities all coming through kind of the door of my office. And that coincided with the AOTI putting out a call actually to create the LGBT good practice guidelines, which I was involved in. And really those two things were happening at the same time, probably about 8 years ago. And it just kind of really got me thinking that there should be more of an OT role in the area of LGBT kind of healthcare in general, and kind of a shock that there wasn't more done on it already. Or could other people also see that kind of potential and area of need? So kind of with those thoughts in mind, I went off and did a master's in gender and sexuality studies over in Amsterdam, which was just a wonderful experience, both academically and personally and everything. And really, I guess since then, since coming back to Ireland, I've just been trying to bring those two things together, kind of both of my degrees together, I guess, as an occupational therapist, with this additional kind of perspective on gender and sexuality and how they can impact health and well-being.
Something that I've seen a lot more in my practice over the past number of years is young people, teenagers, young adults who are maybe exploring their sexuality and their gender identity. And, you know, obviously when I was training as an OT, gender identity wasn't even a question. It's like, no. We didn't even think about it. And so it's been a steep learning curve for me. In terms of that process, how do teenagers or young people kind of explore and express their gender identity in your experience? Or, you know, how can we support this, or can families support this?
Yeah, it's a big question. There's a lot of different probably components to it. I guess I'll preface by saying again that probably the service I work in is with adults, so people that are 18 plus. Mm-hmm. But despite it being, 18 to there's no upper limit of age, the majority of people that I do work with would be considered probably young adults, so probably in that age range of 18 to 25. And so I'm kind of picking them up maybe just after that kind of teenage years, just after secondary school. I would love to say that they were coming into us at 18, but we've quite a long waiting list for the service. So often it's around the age of 20, 21 that they're actually getting seen for their first assessment. And so even though I don't work directly, I think with teenagers, through hearing their stories and their experiences, I think I have a very good kind of insight into how their journey has been. And it sounds cliche, but I guess there's just no one kind of experience, or just no one pathway. Everyone who comes into us has quite a different story and a different kind of process that they're going through. That said, I think there's a number of kind of things that hallmarks maybe that you start to see often during adolescence. And a lot of them are probably quite typical things that teenagers go through anyway, and that people going through puberty go through anyway. But I think when that is also tied up then with an additional layer or degree of questioning your place in the world, your gender identity, your sexuality, that brings with it, and maybe it just kind of amps up everything. It brings with it just an additional layer of emotions and confusion and complexity, in addition to puberty, which is probably already a pretty challenging and complex time, I think, for most adolescents and people going through it. So yeah, that's the start of an answer. What was the rest of the question, Jen? Sorry.
It is a huge question. I suppose just thinking about it, for when we're talking about gender identity, for some people that concept might be relatively new. Could you just talk us through what we mean by that?
Yeah, there's a brilliant diagram that I still always reference. It's also in the AOTI guidelines for any OTs listening. They're freely available on the AOTI website. But it's the genderbread person. And it's just a really nice visual way of kind of presenting what are kind of quite intangible concepts, I guess, such as gender identity, sexual orientation. It's helpful maybe to start with biological sex, which is probably what most of us kind of know. That's being assigned male or female at birth based on your genitalia and also your chromosomal makeup and lots of other biological factors. For most people, their biological sex seems to fit with their kind of gender identity and their place in the world as either a man or a woman, but that's not the case for all people. And I guess gender identity is more of that intangible internal concept of your place, particularly in a social kind of schema of being a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, your sense of masculinity or femininity. And for transgender people, I guess your gender identity is where it doesn't match up with the sex that was assigned to you at birth. So I think if you look across multiple cultures and ages, there has always been trans people of some, form represented in some way. But it definitely, in the last couple of years, I think in line with a lot of kind of just general social movements, has become a lot more visible and a lot more kind of notable, and the numbers seem to be more these days, I think, than in the past. But there's a variety of factors that could be contributing to that.
I think even acknowledging the language and having an understanding is a good starting point. Niall, would you be able to talk us through some of the terminology, even if that's the only thing that people take away from this, that they can, I suppose, acknowledge and raise awareness in their practice?
Yeah. Some of the ones I mentioned there, let's say biological sex and gender identity, maybe is a good place to start. As I said, transgender or being, transgender is when those two things don't match up. Cisgender is a word that people commonly hear, and that's a relatively new word, I guess, but that is being created to describe people whose sense of gender identity and biological sex do match up. Then you have people who are non-binary, I guess, which is also an identity that has been, I think, emerging and increasing a lot in recent years. That's where someone maybe doesn't necessarily identify with either masculinity or femininity, and prefers to have kind of a non-gendered place in the world, and maybe uses non-gendered language. So instead of masculine or feminine pronouns, he, she, they might use they or them, gender neutral. Then within transitioning and the kind of process itself, I guess there's different things to understand. Gender transition is spoken about probably in an oversimple kind of manner, I guess. I don't think gender transition either is just one thing. We as a team would certainly look at it having different components, kind of starting with more of maybe a personal transition, which is somebody figuring out or starting to question or explore their gender for the first time, going on to realize like something doesn't feel right. What is that? Why is that? What do I want to do about it? Do I want to transition? What would be my goals? All of that happening probably more on a psychological and emotional level. And then that may be leading to social transition, which is kind of the social process of coming out and sharing your gender identity with other people, maybe expressing yourself in a different way and kind of signaling to the outside world maybe more about how you actually identify in terms of your gender through your clothing choices, how you groom yourself. And then the medical transition is probably the piece that people know more about in a way, because it tends to be the more sensationalist kind of components, because it's to do with hormones and it's to do with surgeries. And they're hugely important kind of components for trans people, but they're also just one part of the process, I would say. And often the most challenging phase maybe, and the one that requires the most amount of work, is often around the social transition and the trying to start that and advance that. And that's often a massive piece of the journey, as well as, the medical components that people might go on to have. I don't know, were there any other terms in specific that you want?
I think even trans female, trans male.
Yeah, so I guess these days, we would try to use kind of gender affirming language. So if you identify someone as a trans woman, that's identifying them as the gender that they identify with themselves. So that would be someone who is possibly born male or assigned male at birth, but who wants to live their life as a woman. And so then they might identify as a trans woman. Equally, a trans man would be somebody who identifies in a masculine way or as a guy, but perhaps was assigned something different at birth, such as assigned female at birth. So that's kind of, it can be confusing for people to begin with. I think trying to work in that gender affirming way is positive, and we certainly maybe have tried. Language constantly changes and evolves in this area. I'm sure in 5 years' time, what I say on this podcast might be quite, like outdated and need a bit of revisions. And so it's constantly changing. But I think, that kind of intention to try and be affirming and positive in the language in terms of the gender that someone identifies with, it's nice to use language like that rather than maybe more medicalized language like assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. It's more about how the person identifies now.
Really helpful, Niall. What about any kind of myths or misconceptions that you commonly come across, again, that might be helpful for people to learn about?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of, I think, media attention and just general kind of societal interest maybe in this area. And I've never known an area like it to become so polarized in a way. It's maybe there's other things that are like that these days as well. But I think people tend to take very kind of black or white views around this topic. And what gets lost in the middle is the person and their lived experience. So typically, if you don't maybe have any trans or gender diverse people in your life, or you don't work in this area, you'll encounter mainly in the media, I think, headlines about bathroom usage, access to restrooms, sport participation, the medical kind of processes around it. And I think there's a lot of concerns. There's valid concerns, I think, from a women's safety perspective that, are often in the media. But what often gets left out is that usually trans people themselves are a vulnerable and kind of a minority in and of themselves, and often also very at risk in a large amount of public situations or social situations. So I think kind of some of those myths around, participation in sport, around access to gendered spaces, they're all things that do need to be, I think, discussed and thrashed out, and trying to find a good balance for people. But I think that, yeah, what I see working with my clients is that at the end of the day, there's, a young trans person sitting at home reading headlines that they're not welcome to participate in sporting events, or that they're somehow being posed as, a menace to society. And I think it really, those kind of myths really just leave out the actual people at the kind of center or the core of this issue. Equally, on the flip side, I would just say in terms of hormones, I think within the massive kind of online and social media kind of communities, and the huge amount of information that's out there, I think also with hormones, sometimes what I see is that there's kind of a bit of a myth that hormones or medical interventions will change everything for a trans person and will, drastically improve their life. And I think while that is true in some regards, I work with a lot of people who maybe sometimes are quite disappointed that not more has changed after starting their medical transition, or whose expectations from the beginning maybe are just quite unrealistic about what hormones will help them to achieve. And so I think that's kind of what, in my day-to-day practice, more what I may be working with is helping people to plan and set goals that are kind of hopefully realistic, and figure out what other work needs to be done and what other supports they need access to in order to help them get to where they want to go, so that there isn't kind of a sense of, oh, I thought the hormones would fix everything, and then a secondary disappointment that they haven't. Kind of this butterfly effect of I'll start hormones and then emerge and my whole life and personality will be different. And I think that's often not the case.
That's really interesting. And it kind of brings me to the next question a little bit. I'm just wondering, in terms of young people that you're working with, there must be lots of challenges that young people face when they are kind of questioning or affirming their gender identity. Would you be able to just give us an idea of that? But specifically then, as an OT, how do you support young people through that?
Yeah. I think it's on multiple different levels for like a teenager or a young person that's going through this kind of stuff. Maybe with gender, we can start on the kind of physical level, that we're kind of embodied people, and gender can be a social experience, but also very much embodied experience in your own body. And so if you have distress or uncertainty or major kind of questions about your gender, then you can have a lot of maybe physical dysphoria. So gender dysphoria maybe is a term we should have defined, which is, again, a discomfort and distress caused by not being comfortable with your gender or with your body. And so on a physical level, I think there can be a lot of distress and discomfort. Again, there's probably a degree of that for lots of young people and teenagers, I think, who are going through puberty. But again, specific changes that happen at puberty can be very distressing for people who are questioning their gender, or who know that they're trans. So, for example, menstruation, having periods, erections and libido and sex drive, all of these things that, in addition to the physical changes that happen at puberty in terms of getting taller, getting broader, voices dropping, hair developing, lots of these things, I guess, can be very distressing on a physical level. And that, of course, then can impact things on a mental health and on an emotional level in terms of mood, in terms of self-confidence and self-acceptance, maybe being quite difficult. And on a, I guess, in addition then to that kind of emotional and psychological turmoil that people can go through, it can start to impact things on a social level of, who I am, who do I fit in with, who are my gang, who do I want to be, your sexual orientation, your sexual development, that you're still figuring out often at that age and into your 20s. And I think then where I see it and maybe where my interest lies is on an occupational level, then what starts to happen if someone is going through, a young person is going through all of those things. So you'll start maybe to see major occupations such as going to school and having that kind of productive role for a young person, going to college, going to work, that those things can really start to drop off sometimes. Difficulties navigating their gender transition in a kind of social environment like that, like school or like a classroom situation. Like social activities and hobbies and leisure interests. It's a real note once you start seeing these things, even though I think society as a whole has come on in Ireland a lot in the last kind of 20, 30 years, but there still is a remarkable kind of shift around that teenage years into things becoming very gender segregated, actually, in some instances, schools becoming gender segregated, a lot of sports and kind of things like that still being gender segregated. And I guess that can be really difficult if, you're used to hanging around with boys and girls or playing sports with boys and girls, and then all of a sudden you're being grouped in with this group of people who you actually don't feel like you belong with or who you kind of fit in with. So again, maybe a drop off or an avoidance of kind of those occupations can definitely start to happen. And on a self-care level, maybe also a lot of difficulties, I think, in terms of just self-care occupations, with showering, with, basic hygiene, with, being comfortable with their bodies, I guess, if there is that difficulty, engaging in self-care occupations can get really tricky. So there are some of the difficulties, I think, that as OTs we might see, but there's lots of things then that, OTs can potentially work with people on then that are related to those things.
Sounds like there's the working with the person, but there's also a societal challenge. As you said, the kind of segregation, the genderization of occupations is huge. And when even thinking about my own kids kind of being split into different teams, choir becomes kind of boys and girls voices. There's
Absolutely.
lots of change in the experiences that people have from primary into secondary.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of, we're in a time now maybe in society where, of course, like things are allowed, like boys are allowed to do ballet. I don't know, I'm just trying to think of kind of an extreme gendered, example, but things like that where, of course, a boy might be allowed to do ballet, and maybe that wouldn't have been the case 40, 50 years ago. But whether that means that it's socially acceptable or socially sanctioned or socially encouraged still might be different. I think we still have a bit of a way to go on that, maybe, that some things remain maybe quite skewed either towards boys or girls. And there's a fantastic BBC very brief video you can watch on YouTube we did it in developmental psychology back in college, but it actually always stuck with me, where they get some newborns. They get newborns that are assigned female at birth and dress them in like blue baby grows, and maybe they're toddlers, and in kind of typically masculine clothing, and vice versa, babies that are assigned female at birth, dress them in blue, and get people to come in and interact with them. And you can just see how people play and interact even in very different ways with kids that are as young as a couple of months, a couple of months old, a year or two old. Lots of reinforcement for the baby that was perceived to be a boy of, very physical play, rough and tumble, aren't you a big strong man type stuff. And then with the child that they assume to be female, lots of very delicate, or aren't you lovely, aren't you very pretty, shall we play with the dolly? So you can kind of just see how I think our occupations are just influenced from a very, very young age based on actually our perceived gender. And so we've come a long way, but I think there is still quite a long way to go as well.
Absolutely. And I think that plays through in schools, and we're seeing now more and more people being diagnosed autistic or ADHD, and girls in particular, where previously girls were kind of pushed into roles in the classroom where you sit and you be still, and there was maybe a bit more acceptance for boys to be able to bounce around the place, and
Yeah,
and now we're kind of recognizing actually that's not okay.
yeah,
Just that awareness is starting to increase, but we do have a way to go, I think.
absolutely. So I think there's really interesting links between gender identity and occupational identity and occupational opportunity. So there's a lot to explore from a more occupational science kind of perspective, I think.
Niall, it's no mean feat establishing your role in a service, especially like an ever changing area in society now, when we're trying to develop OT roles in different areas. What kind of approaches do you use specifically in your area that really helps to ground your skills as an OT and I suppose keep those professional boundaries when you're working in a multidisciplinary team?
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure, because I think you're starting off without much of a roadmap, and then you're trying to figure out your place within the multidisciplinary team and what the unique OT offering is, I guess. I think thankfully as a service and as a team, there's a huge value placed on the OT role. And I think it came about because just lots of the people that we were seeing, there was a shift in the profile in terms of, I think, complexity. And we were just getting a lot of people with really, really clear cases of kind of occupational deprivation, and people just really not engaging in any meaningful occupation outside of their home or outside of their bedroom in some cases. And so I think kind of the role in a way of OT and the team has been in response to that, in response to the fact that there's kind of a clear client need there, where people have withdrawn quite a lot from their major kind of occupations and their social outlets. And that certainly isn't helped by then a lengthy wait list coming to see us, where sometimes things just, get embedded over time. So my role then kind of takes up, I guess, where the team will refer to me generally with a profile like that. Maybe somebody who maybe has just gotten stuck, left school either early or at leaving cert. We're dealing with kind of the fallout of COVID at the moment, where maybe they intended to take a bit of a break, a bit of a gap year that has turned into 3 or 4 years. They're mainly existing online, possibly have good social connections, but mainly online and less in person. Um, and so probably my approach as an OT then with those kind of clients, it goes back a lot to maybe what a lot of OTs in mental health are kind of doing, of really just trying to build rapport first of all with the person, and get to know them in a kind of paced and kind of gradual way, to figure out kind of what is meaningful to them, what things interest them and stimulate them outside of their, like, what are the other aspects to their identity outside of their gender identity, which is important but one part of their identity. um and then trying to just set some gradual goals, I think, around that. Sometimes as the OT, I think you're trying to be the middle person between maybe team expectations or team kind of goals for that person, and then what is actually important and meaningful to the client themselves. And so then just supporting the client to try and work on that with kind of I guess I generally try and explore the goals maybe that I think will help them overall, and also will help their transition in terms of getting a bit more socially integrated, maybe finding occupations that they can do with others, in person and offline, kind of, and getting re-engaged a bit with communities kind of offline. And it's a really interesting, the online offline thing is a really interesting kind of factor with this client group, because it's just so, there's so much value, I think, to the online communities that people are part of, and they're often there in very dark times or in times when someone has no other kind of social outlet or community. But from an OT perspective, I just see it so much that if someone is existing purely online and doesn't have maybe much in-person interaction or activities, just the loss of skills and of just, like, basic things of being able to leave the house comfortably and confidently, being able to take public transport, being able to, you know, navigate a social situation with 1, 2, 3 people. They're skills that are going to be needed to transfer into lots of things for this young person, whether that is going back to education or getting a job or, mixing kind of socially. And so I think trying to really work on those is kind of the main crux of the work that I do with people, trying to get people back out and engaging in some kind of meaningful occupations in the community again. And from a team perspective, I think that's important because they're seeing how is the person navigating their gender and their social transition in kind of real world offline settings. And, that forms part of the team's decision making then on medical decisions.
It's a big thing because I guess I would see a lot of young people experimenting or moving their gender online because it's a safe space to do that, where they can change their gender relatively quickly and be accepted for just who they are because nobody sees them. So I can imagine that it is a safe place for many young people.
Exactly. And an important starting point maybe, but then needing to move it on for that.
Absolutely. In terms of if we have any OTs who are working with a young person who is maybe questioning their gender, or for any parents who have a child or a young adult who is beginning to question or is talking to them about their gender identity, is there any kind of top tips or any things that you think would be important for that person who's supporting somebody with their gender identity to know?
Yeah, I think there's a few guiding principles maybe that can be followed. I think probably number one relates to what I was just talking about, and there's a very OT maybe perspective on things, but really just trying to encourage and support that young person to stay engaged with whatever it is that is in some way meaningful to them. If that's a friend group, a social activity, a family outing that they go on, just really trying to, I guess, keep that person connected with something, and not, I guess, where we see a lot of difficulty coming around is where someone has just kind of withdrawn and really stepped away from kind of the world, because it's much harder to take that first step back in then, isn't it? And that's kind of a slow place maybe when you're starting your OT kind of rehab work. From there, it's a really slow and paced approach that you have to take. So I think the importance of that, of social connection, of trying to connect the person with safe spaces and supportive kind of communities and social groups, again, offline, in addition to online, I think. So maybe that young person's experience of social settings hasn't been great, if that was in school or if there was bullying or if they lost a friend group or things like that. But trying to, I guess, find something that, a friend group or a social group that is more suitable, or that where they do have common ground with, that might be common ground over being LGBT, or it might be common ground through neurodivergence and being in a nice neuro-affirming kind of social setting. Or lots of people that I work with actually don't really want to connect with people over just being, we're both trans, but they'd rather connect through an interest and through an occupation, which is another good way to go about it. I think for parents, having parental support is really important. There are parent peer support groups as well for parents and family members of children and teenagers who are questioning their gender identity, and probably just keeping, it's very difficult, a lot easier said than done, but just trying to keep the lines of communication kind of open, between the young person and their parent or their support worker. Because I think I have to say, like in my work, and we do meet lots of families and parents, it's thankfully relatively rare that a parent really isn't supportive or is really opposed to this. Often parents are just coming with a huge amount of concern over, what does this mean for my kid? What kind of a life are they going to have? And often it's, just a lack of maybe conversations, that it's very difficult to have these conversations for the parent and the young person. And so it ends up just going kind of quiet and not talked about, maybe, on a regular basis. Coming out is definitely not a one-time event. It's, and I think that having regular conversations and keeping the kind of lines of communication open is really important.
Tenny have some good resources for parents, I think.
Absolutely. So Tenny would run Transparency, I think is the name of the peer support group, and I think they have one or two branches around Ireland, in Dublin, maybe Cork, but there's lots of online kind of supports as well, through Tenny, through LGBT Ireland, and then of course, like, just family therapy or a parent seeking therapy themselves, I think can also be really important to support yourself, to support your young person, kind of. There's practical things then, I guess, if you're getting more into a stage where somebody is really trying to, do something about their gender and wants to take some steps. And probably the things I talked about under kind of socially transitioning is, a good place to start is identifying maybe one or two safe people or safe spaces where the young person wants to maybe try something new. That might be as small as wearing nail polish, and trying to express a bit of femininity maybe that way, or it might be trialing a new name with a couple of people and seeing how that goes. There's a bit of talk and controversy at the moment over whether social transitioning is a neutral act or not, but the way I would view it is kind of that, it's very reversible, and it's kind of a thing that if you take one step at a time and do it, I guess helping the young person, whether you're a therapist or a parent, helping the young person to just kind of sometimes maybe slow it down a little bit, figure out what steps they want to take, and then taking kind of one step at a time and reviewing and reassessing after each step is taken to see, do you want to take another step, or does this feel good for the moment, or did this not actually bring about kind of the hope, what you hoped would change. So kind of step-by-step approach, which can be really hard when you're faced with something as massive and kind of intangible, I think, as gender and gender identity.
So gentle exploration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Niall, I feel like we could talk forever. There's so much more I wanted to ask you. So we might try and get you back at some stage. But thank you so much for sharing a little bit of insight into your work and the type of thing that you do. And also thank you for forging the path for OTs in this area. I think you're right. It's really critical that we have more OTs. I know that the service is looking for more OTs. Am I right on that?
Yeah, we're hoping to expand if possible. So some funding is hopefully coming its way, for some more OT resources.
Which will be fantastic.
Yeah.
So thank you. Really appreciate your time today.
No problem at all. Thank you very much for having me.
That's all for today's episode on the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it informative and engaging. If you've any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at irishotpodcast@gmail.com or connect on Instagram or Facebook.
And remember to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss an episode. If you found this episode helpful, please leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve the show, so please do leave it. Thank you for listening to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by myself, Jen Trzeciak.
And myself, Aideen Ruttledge.
We look forward to sharing more insights and knowledge with you in future episodes. Until then, take care.